Okay, so for today's training, we're taking a look at a question that I got over on the Patreon exclusive Discord, where someone wanted some help lighting this environment. This is as I received the scene, and by the end of it, these are the results that we got to. Now, this is twofold. Number one, there are some subjective things in there that I'm going to talk about, some artistic tastes and some choices that I made. But more than that, I'm going to talk about some objective principles as well. For example, this initial render untouched took 23 seconds to render, which isn't too bad. But in the end, we got this one down to 6 seconds, which is obviously better for production. Before we jump into this scene, I'm just going to talk about some general interior lighting principles, and then we'll actually open up this scene and I'll make all the improvements live so you can see what I did. So let's approach this. Now, there are two different setups here for room lighting, and let's talk about the difference for each one. So let me just grab a few things here, and there we go. Reverse the normals. Okay, so the first setup is an enclosed room. This is where you have 4 walls and a ceiling. Let's also reverse the normals there. And this is if you are going to be needing to cover this room from all angles. Now, this isn't typical for me. I will, wherever I can, treat this more like a set than an actual interior space. Usually my camera is only operating within this 180-degree area here. So at most I'll have 3 walls, 1, 2, 3. In many cases I can get away with 2 walls, and in some cases I can get away with 1 wall. So that's where I wanted to bring up this. Now, the advantage of having a 2-wall or a 3-wall or even a 1-wall set is, one, it's just a little bit easier access. Now, of course, you could just come here and turn on backface culling, and we could see into that room no problem. But the big thing here is, notice how my camera has free range. I can operate outside the bounds of the room, and also I'm able to let in more light. The most important factor with any kind of interior setup in a 3D engine is going to be lighting. So the problem with a lot of setups is you don't have enough light in your space and you're dealing with a lot of noise. Now, I'm going to show you some ways on how we can combat that noise. But as a starting point, you want to be able to work with a good open space where you can let in a lot of light from something like an HDRI, which has a lot of variation. That'll make sense as we go here, but let's just get started. Let's go to rendered view and let's kill our environment lighting here. Let's just make this black. Now, one thing I see a lot of beginners do is fill the space with too many light sources. So let me show you what that might look like. They might be dealing with noise in their renders, so they start to flood the space with a lot of different lights. And the problem with this is you lose any kind of form on your objects. This is not a very appealing or interesting light setup. So let's select all these lights, and let's move them to a collection just called 1. So this is our first setup, and let's turn that off and let's try a different setup. For this one, we're just gonna have 2 light sources. We're gonna have one main one that's gonna be like a window. So that's what this is simulating. So this is kind of like our key light. It's our main light source that's giving form to our subject here. And while we're here, let's just position this camera so we can have kind of a baseline of what we're trying to achieve here. And then for the second light source, I'm going to take advantage of an HDRI. And the reason I love HDRI so much is because they have a lot of variety. It's not just one solid color. So if I just filled the room with white light, you could see that has the same problem. It gets rid of all the form. But if we have an HDRI, which stands for high dynamic range image, it has that range from lows to highs. So it has that dynamic effect on the lighting. So not everything is this soft single light source. And we can position this, if we just look at our HDRI here. What I like to do is try to mimic the light source that I have here. So in this HDRI, we have 2 main light sources, 2 windows that are letting off the most light. So I'll try to roughly position those kind of where my other light source is coming from. So something like that might work, and I can tweak this. And what this is doing, if I turn this off, is this is acting as my fill light. You see these areas here? when I have this, I'm filling those in, but in hopefully a tasteful way. Now, I might lower this to have a little bit more contrast, but really good lighting is simple in my opinion. Now, of course, you may have other objects in this scene that require some more finesse and some other lights in the scene to make sure you have highlights on the subjects you want highlights on. But let's build this out a little bit. Let me grab some assets here. I don't know, let's grab a bed, for instance. Let's make this kind of like an interior room kind of setup here. Now, if I'm showing this light source where this area light is, I would probably have to justify that. So I could explain that light source by cutting a hole here, and I could add some window geometry there. And also, we don't have to settle with our HDRI as we see it right here. What we could do is add a mixed color node. Now, there are a lot of ways to do this, but this is my favorite one. And then drop down a light path node and use the is camera ray so that basically everything the camera sees is this second input, which we can make this white. And then everything that's lighting or influencing the scene is this first input, which is our HDRI. And I'm going to make that even brighter white by dropping down an RGB and a math node, and I'm going to add a value of something really high like 20, just so that's pure white. And again, whether you're using a 2-wall, 3-wall, or 4-wall setup really has to do with what angles you plan on getting out of this room. If this was like a video game environment and we're walking around, obviously we would need a more complete setup, which brings up the question, well, how do I light that if I have a fully enclosed setup? But what about something that's fully enclosed like this? Now, the HDRI that we had before isn't fully able to get into the room. Now, this still isn't too noisy. This is still pretty all right. But this is a trick that I use sometimes where we can actually add a point light. And in the shader editor, let's go to the object settings for that light and click use nodes. Now, what's cool is we can go here to my documents, HDRI. Let's grab that same HDRI, Artist Workshop, and let's actually use that for the color of the light. Now, by default, this isn't going to look great. It's just going to be like a movie projector, which doesn't really make sense. Let's increase the strength. Now, what's cool about this is under your light settings, we can go to radius, and as we increase that radius, that's softening out that light source, which is really nice. We can increase the strength even more to something like 10. And this is one way in an enclosed environment where I'll add more variation to the scene. We can rotate this around, but this is a nice way to introduce some of that HDRI lighting that we had before with an open environment, but in something that's closed. Now, one thing you have to be mindful of is if you have an actor passing in front of this, that's going to cause some issues. So what I'll do typically is I'll use Blender's light linking to make sure this doesn't have shadow influence on anything that's going to be passing in front of it. Or you could just turn off cast shadows altogether, and that's just going to add some interesting variation without casting shadows. So this again acts as kind of fill light in the scene, and you can increase the radius, you can change the image that you have in there, you can move it around the scene, rotate it around, do whatever you want to do here. The biggest rule of thumb for me on any interior lighting setup is less is more. As soon as you start, adding other light sources in here and trying to get rid of noise by just adding more light, you're going to start to lose the dimension in the room, and things are going to start to have a distinct kind of fake CG look, which may be hard to put your finger on if you don't know exactly what's causing it. So I would say pick really one key light source in the room, usually a window, doesn't have to be a window, could be like an overhead light even. Be very, very intentional on where you have that key light source. And then from there you can try to fill the scene in with some light variation. Now, because these walls are all white and the ceiling's white and the floor's white, this has a very strong fill effect on the room, and it's kind of getting rid of some of that dimension. But I'm not going to go through adding texture to each wall and the floor and the ceiling, but yeah, keep in mind you would have some textures in here, maybe like a wood floor, maybe something different going on than just pure white. which is going to change your lighting approach. So that's kind of the basics of interior lighting. Less is more. On your fill lights, I would try to use a variation source like an HDRI. Now that's not getting into other principles like color contrast. Color contrast is a big one on my projects. For example, I might have a cooler light source coming from outside, and this one, the fill light on the interior, I might drop down like a mixed color node, change this to color, and I'll have a warming effect where the lighting in here is going to be warmer, and I can change the influence of that. Now, you don't always have to do blues and oranges or yellows for color contrast. This is just kind of the range for natural light. Now, there's one essential source that I'm getting a lot of my learning from for choices with color contrast and lighting. This book right here is a must read if you're an artist. It doesn't matter if you're a painter or a 3D artist or, working on compositing, whatever you're doing, this is a must read. This is Color and Light, A Guide for the Realistic Painter by James Gurney. And in this, he's going to go over so many key topics, like some of these things I'm talking about. Just wanted to plug that real quick. You should definitely go pick this up. Now, obviously, I can show you one setup here, and this might work for some cases, but this isn't going to work for every case. So instead of me showing you a particular setup, it's more important that I talk about general principles. And that's kind of what I've tried to cover here. All right, so now we've talked about some principles in general. Let's take a look at your specific scene and how exactly I made the improvements. I'm going to approach this from an artistic standpoint as well as an optimization and kind of production practical standpoint of how can we make this render quickly and work for the needs of this particular project. Now, I don't know all of the details for this project, but I know enough kind of background information to make some decisions here. So I just wanted to show you the kind of before results. So we have a render time of 23 seconds, which I'll write down so we can remember for later. And then we also have kind of this look of this interior scene. Now, from the email that I got sending the blend file, I understand that this is supposed to be kind of someone's office space, like a study, and it's supposed to be kind of dramatic and moody in a nighttime environment. So that's what we're going to go for the look of things. So yeah, let's just have a look at the overall scene. The first thing I noticed is this is a fully enclosed 4-wall and ceiling setup. Now, nothing wrong with this necessarily. I'm just gonna decrease my focal length here so I can see what's going on. But you need to approach this from a practical standpoint. I don't know this particular, what this is going to be used for, but I can imagine that most of the camera angles, if not all of the camera angles, are going to be kind of looking at these two walls. Are we ever really going to have need to look out this window? Maybe if there's something going on out there, but anytime you're going to be looking at this window, really it's going to be the focal point of what you're looking at. So what I'm trying to say is if we can make decisions about what this scene is for and what this scene isn't for, then we can right off the bat quickly start to optimize this scene. So really you should approach this more from a set building standpoint than a home building standpoint. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the things we don't need. Now I know for sure we aren't going to need this back wall. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I can't imagine any shots where we're going to be facing in this direction. What we're going to do is go to edit mode, face select. Let's select these faces, get rid of them. These ones, get rid of those. And let's take it as far as having only a 2-wall setup. Now, the person who sent me this blend file, feel free to correct me, let me know, hey, I really needed that window. I have shots where I'm going to show that. But I just, for the purpose of this tutorial, want to get thinking about, I'm just going to make an archive here, what's really necessary and what's not. We have the freedom to move our camera outside the bounds of this space, and we can also introduce more lighting into this space, which is a really big advantage with any kind of interior setup. Now, one thing we can do is we can extend what you already have here. So we have plenty of room to play with. Look how much more freedom we have with the camera. We can use longer focal lengths. This is an 18 millimeter. We could have something like a 50 millimeter. We can move outside where the walls were. So let's go ahead and take a look at your light setup. Let's go to rendered view, and I'm gonna split the viewport here, vertical split, and let's bring up your shader editor. Now, one thing, obviously, that's different now from what we had before is we're letting in more of the environment light. Looks like you're using an add-on, Easy HDRI. That's fine. I'm not familiar with this one. I don't use it. We're just going to use a normal environment just so I have control over all of the variables here. And now, as I said before, and kind of the lead up to this video, is we should identify what our key light source is. In my other example, the key light source was coming through the window. In this case, because we're going for kind of a more dramatic nighttime scene, I imagine our key light source is going to be one of these lights that we have here that are focused on the documents that we have on the desk. So rather than focusing all of our attention with the HDRI being the key light source, let's just choose an HDRI that can kind of stay out of the way, but still give us some very basic light variation. So I might grab, well, let's look at a few here. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try to build the mood of this HDRI. The reason I'm using an HDRI is for value variation and intensity. I'm going to drop down a mix color. I'm going to change this to color, and then I'm going to introduce more of a blue color to this. And we're also going to decrease the strength because this isn't the main key light source. This is just kind of the fill. It's giving us a soft blue glow. So really, I'm going to lower this to something quite low. Let's go to our camera view, and I think that could be nice. Now, let's look at our actual light sources here. Let's select one of them. Let's hit Shift-G to select all by type, and we're going to move these to a new collection called Lights. And I believe these are linked, so if we change one, it should change everything. All right, one thing I'll do, again, adding variation to your lights where possible is good practice. So I'm going to get rid of this black body. I don't really use that personally. And I'm going to go ahead and grab a light from my Patreon light texture pack that you can go get on Patreon. And let's try this one, and we'll go into the light strength with that. And this to me is just a quick way we can add a little bit of variation to that light source. You can see the difference there, a little softer. We increase the radius so it can still fill in the lights up top. Let me just get this the right size. And yeah, it's just casting a little bit of variation on your scene. We could switch things up with our color contrast here. For example, these neon lights, that's what I'm assuming these are. What if we made these more of like a blue light, and then this light source, we could introduce more of like a warm color. This is really up to you. This is just one example of how you could start to bring in color contrast into your scene. And now for these neon signs, this is just an emission node. Notice how it's just emission, and so the lighting is consistent all across the board. What you could do is drop down a layer weight node. This is a little trick. And then a math node. Set this to divide. And we could divide the facing angle from the Fresnel angle. Plug that into strength. And you kind of get this cool effect where it's brighter in the middle and it fades off towards the end, and then it's brighter at the very end again. This is a technique that I came up with. You can further tweak it with like a map range node. If you don't want it to be quite so dark, you could also increase the maximum brightness. Play with whether you're clamping that value or not. And yeah, I think that is a little bit more interesting than what it was before. So we're going to keep that. And we can also drop down a mix shader and a light path node. We've done this a lot before. We're going to use the camera ray so that what we see is this setup, but what's contributing to the lighting in the environment is this other emission node that doesn't have that complex setup, and we can increase the emission strength here to something really high. That way we see what we want to see in this slot, and then we have the lighting effect on the environment with this slot. So that's just a little something I would change with that lighting. So yeah, what have we done so far? We've simplified the scene. Rather than approaching this like we're building a house with 4 walls and a ceiling, we're approaching this as if we're building a set. So I'm getting rid of the ceiling to let in more light from an HDRI. I'm getting rid of 2 of the walls that I don't foresee having use of. Now, you may have a different opinion. This is your set. You may decide, actually, I really want to be able to approach a scene in a way where I can look out here and see a window. That's totally up to you. Personally, I would definitely approach this as if you're building a set and I would just have 2 walls, just simplify things. Anyway, hopefully that's been useful. Here's a little before and after. Thanks for submitting this through the Patreon Discord. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask, follow up with this. We went from a render time of 23 seconds down to a render time of just under 7 seconds, which is definitely going to help with your production. And yeah, thanks for being a Patreon supporter, for sending in the question, and I'll see you on the next one.